Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, friends and colleagues, good afternoon and welcome to the PRIO Annual Peace Address. My name is Henrik Urdal. As the director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO, it is my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. In the PRIO Annual Peace Address series, which has now been running for over a decade, we invite speakers from all over the globe, from a range of backgrounds and fields, academia, journalism, politics, activism, to speak on a topic of significance for peace and conflict in our world today. 2024 is a significant year for elections, with nearly half of the global population headed to the polls. But will it prove to be a positive year for democracy? While official elections are indeed being held, many of these are taking place in countries where democratic norms and values are under pressure, or indeed in autocracies where the democratic credentials of elections are highly dubious. Authoritarianism and populism appear to be on the rise, including in Europe and the United States. And with the re-election of Donald Trump to the US presidency, it is an open question who will be the champion of democratic ideals on the world stage. Our speaker this afternoon is uniquely situated to help us understand this turbulent moment through which we are living and its implications for the fate of democracy and popular mobilization in the years to come. They are one of the world's leading experts on mass movements, political violence, and civil resistance, and a long-time friend of PRIO, Professor Erica Chenoweth. Erica is the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment, an academic dean for faculty development at Harvard Kennedy School, a faculty dean at Forsheimer House at Harvard College, and a Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. They direct the Nonviolent Action Lab at Harvard's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and are the founding co-director of the Crowd Counting Consortium, a collaborative public interest and research project that collects data on the size of political crowds protesting in the US. Erica is not only a leading researcher in their field, but also an important commentator and communicator of research-based insights to activists, practitioners, policymakers, and the general public. They have received numerous awards and recognitions for their efforts to inform and empower through knowledge gleaned from the social sciences. At PRIO, we are committed to engaged excellence. We believe that top-quality scholarly work and impactful exchange with practitioners go hand in hand. Erica's tireless efforts perfectly express this spirit. I look forward to hearing what Erica has to say during their address today and to a lively debate with our esteemed panel. I would also like to take a moment to express my gratitude to the individuals, organizations, and public agencies that continually support PRIO's research endeavors, both as funders and as partners, many of whom are represented here this afternoon. Your support is instrumental to the important work that we do here at PRIO, and I look forward to seeing what opportunities for collaboration the coming years will bring. There is certainly every indication that PRIO's research will only become more important going forward. I must also extend my appreciation to the PRIO team whose hard work has made this annual peace address possible. A quick but important piece of information before we start. The fire exits are at the back of the room where you entered. And also, I think to my right, Today's event will be video recorded and live streamed, and we have a photographer taking pictures for social media. Please let any of our staff know should you not want to have your picture taken. A word, finally, on the format for this afternoon's event. In a moment, I will be inviting Erica to the stage for the PRIO Annual Peace Address 2024. Following the lecture, there will be a performance of the award-winning Norwegian pop trio Nummer 4. After that, we proceed to a conversation between Erica, the Secretary General of the Norwegian People's Aid, Raymond Johansen, and PRIO senior researcher Håkon Gjerløv. After our conversation, you are all invited to join us for a reception. Please note that there will be an art exhibition at the reception showcasing the works of Norwegian visual artist Schwan Dler Karadaki. The pieces will focus on aspects of democracy, language, and power. But first, and most importantly, Erica, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for the honor of giving this year's PRIO Annual Peace Address here at this world-class institution of research and impact, where I have such esteemed colleagues in whom I hold such high admiration and affection. In my view, as Henrik said, the work of PRIO has never been more important and is only going to become even more important than it is today, and so I'm so grateful for everyone who's here today and the way that you've contributed and will continue to contribute to the important efforts here. So I was asked to comment on this question: can civil society save global democracy? And let me just give a very direct answer at the top. Yes, civil society can save, improve, renew global democracy. In fact, according to many different research projects, including these two books here, civil society is one of the few reliable ways over all historical periods in all countries in which democracy has been developed, cultivated, protected, defended, and renewed. Almost every progressive egalitarian change that has taken place around the world has done so because ordinary people engaged in some kind of collective action where they pressured elites and institutions to accommodate their needs. And that said, today we have a lot of work to do. We can renew global democracy, but it will take some time, some effort, and some sound strategy to deal with the formidable challenges ahead. So in this talk, I want to motivate the remainder of my time by describing a puzzle that has been on my mind for a couple of years. I want to provide an explanation for it, and then I want to offer some ideas for how to address where we are. So in my lab, and I apologize for my voice, I'm recovering, believe it or not, from a long cold. In my lab, we've long maintained data on mass mobilizations for what we call maximalist claims. Maximalist claims are claims in which people are mobilizing to try to oust the incumbent national leader or create an independent country by kicking out a foreign colonial power, a foreign military occupation, or seceding. So they're called maximalist because they would fundamentally alter relations between state and society, and in some cases the nature of the state. But many famous people power movements would fall into this category. For example, the Polish Solidarity movement would be an example of a maximalist campaign, ultimately when they were demanding the ouster of the communist regime and the ability to engage in free and fair elections. The South African anti-apartheid movement is a maximalist campaign seeking to overthrow the apartheid government and install a multiracial democracy. There are many other examples of pro-democratic movements against autocratic regimes that count as maximalist campaigns. And in this data set, what we do is we look at those in which people are primarily using people power or civil resistance, when ordinary people engage in collective action using nonviolent techniques like protests, strikes, boycotts, stayaways, etc. and then campaigns that use armed struggle, the more familiar techniques of armed revolutionary rebellion that PRIO maintains data on and in collaboration with other colleagues in Sweden. And so what this slide shows should be some good news, which is to say that armed resistance engaged in maximalist campaigns has been declining significantly since at least the 1970s, and is very rare now to have new onsets of armed rebellions. So this is consistent with other studies that say that armed revolution has been declining in its prominence in the world. And what this is also showing is that the use of nonviolent resistance has been increasing, especially since, again, the 1970s, when it flipped to becoming basically the most common form of maximalist mobilization. And in the last couple of decades, there have been more mass mobilizations of this kind using nonviolent methods than in the entire 20th century combined. So if you feel like you're living through a time that's tumultuous and uncertain, and there's lots of people out in the streets doing lots of things, that is true, and it's very unique. It's unique to the time we live in, and it is going to motivate this very important puzzle. The puzzle is that we clearly have plenty of capacity for mass mobilization around the world, most of it pro-democratic. The second element of this is that we have plenty of knowledge and training materials and examples that we even have lived through ourselves in many cases of where popular mobilization has worked and why it's worked. For example, my colleague James Lawson, who recently passed away, was a very important leader in the US civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. He led the Nashville campaign to desegregate the city. And he said to me that when he was in prison for conscientious objection during the Korean War, he studied how to do nonviolent resistance to help liberate Black Americans from the Jim Crow segregation system. And he said, what I did was I read Gandhi's autobiography and the Bible. And that is what we had. You all have online manuals. You have documentaries. You have feature films. You have any number of different toolkits that you can use and share to do effective nonviolent mobilization. So you have no excuse, he said to me. So we should be in the golden age of civil resistance and democracy. Instead, colleagues at the Varieties of Democracy Data Project, Freedom House, and elsewhere tell us that, in fact, we're in the third wave of autocratization around the world. And the ability of civil resistance to produce these breakthroughs in authoritarian regimes has truly plummeted. And these are the success rates that we see today. The success rate is counted as the ability to achieve the maximalist objective, that is ousting the incumbent national leader, or achieving territorial independence within a year of the peak of the campaign. And you can see that there was kind of a golden age between the 1980s and the early 2010s, and then there's been a sharp, indecisive decline that puts us back to about 1920s levels of success of these movements. Now, I hate to say it, but it's actually worse than it looks, because the successes that have occurred in places like Egypt in 2011 or Tunisia in 2011 have been very short-lived and created important vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to counter-revolutionary overtaking or authoritarian backsliding in both cases and many others. The second way that this is bad news is that the defeats have been very costly. So places like Myanmar, Syria, and Libya have seen massive violence breaking out. And then the third piece is that it's not just maximalist campaigns that are experiencing these setbacks. In new data that I've collected with my colleague Suyan Kang, we found that movements that are making more reformist demands, these are the much more common types all around the world in democracies and autocracies alike. These are policy-based movements looking for economic, educational, political reform, civil rights, etc., have also started to be defeated at higher rates than in the past, and are succeeding at lower levels. So we're not in a golden age, we're in a major recession of the effectiveness of civil resistance as a technique, just as it's becoming so common around the world. So the big puzzle is, why has nonviolent resistance been increasing in frequency but also declining in its effectiveness? So what I'm going to do is talk first about how people power has succeeded in the past. So what do we know about why it has worked before? And then I'm going to talk about how the new autocratic alliance has been able to adapt to those four major reasons why these movements have succeeded and protected themselves against it, and then shared knowledge with others about how to do that. And then I'm going to walk you through some ideas about how to adapt to that. So, how and why has people power succeeded in the past? The consensus, I think, in the social sciences is that there are four major kind of groups of things that successful movements have done. The first is that they have mobilized large and diverse participation bases. And that has allowed them then to activate the relationships in society and the sort of resources and leverage that come from building a large popular base to extract concessions from their opponents, and even to begin to divide dictatorships, especially, from some of the most important sources of their support within their society. So loyalty shifts among key social pillars like the security forces, economic and business community, cultural and religious authorities, state media, civil servants. Those pillars are all kind of varying in their loyalty to an incumbent. And movements that have succeeded have done so because they've imposed decisive shifts in whether people in those pillars thought it would be a good idea to continue going along with the incumbent or moving out of the way and allowing a movement to overtake the system. So for example, many of you might be familiar with the kind of seminal case of Serbia, where in 2000 the so-called bulldozer revolution took place. In the key moment of confrontation between hundreds of thousands of demonstrators and the security forces in Belgrade who were defending the sort of key buildings associated with the government. The time came for the security forces to shoot on the demonstrators. The order was heard over walkie-talkies, and nobody shot into the crowd of demonstrators. That was an example of a loyalty shift, a defection, right? And so they didn't have to put down their guns and join the protesters for the protesters to know that they were not going to shoot upon them, and they just walked through the lines and occupied those buildings, and Milosevic fled the country and said he was retiring to spend more time with his grandson. So that's an example of a loyalty shift or one of these important defections that are so decisive in determining the outcomes of people power movements, right? So they typically don't win by just convincing the autocrat that, by melting their hearts or something. They win by dislocating them from their sources of power. And that's potentially the most important insight emerging from these kind of 20th century iconic campaigns. The third thing that successful campaigns have done in the past is that they've maintained their own organizational discipline. They've stuck to their strategy and plan and been resilient even as repression has escalated against them. So if you think about iconic examples like Selma in the United States, the civil rights movement facing down horrible kind of brutality by white supremacist forces, the Ku Klux Klan, the police, sending dogs against children, things like that. The movement was able to stick to its own plan and maintain discipline in a way that made the obvious and stark to the public who was in the moral right and who wasn't. And ultimately, the movement was able to gain more sympathy and support in places where it was clear that the police were overreaching and being especially brutal to unarmed demonstrators. And then the fourth thing that successful movements do is that they innovate tactics so that they aren't over-relying on protest or street demonstrations in order to win, but they can shift and maneuver when those types of things become too dangerous or vulnerable in some way. So they generally use forms of mass non-cooperation, for example, economic non-cooperation, boycott strikes, stayaways, factory occupations, and things along those lines in order to win. So let me talk about the fact that these four key factors have now been adapted against by sort of an autocratic alliance that began to emerge in around 2007 and adapt to these four elements pretty explicitly, culminating in a set of common strategies that are now seen diffused all across the world among autocratic governments and autocratic movements. What's important here is that there's been both formal and informal cooperation, including bilateral security alliances, most recently this past year between China and Russia, for example, and a real convergence between Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, and others, based on a shared analysis that color revolutions, as they call them, are basically more or less existential threats to their stability, and they cast them as basically deliberate attempts by the West to interfere with and destabilize their countries. So Putin talks about these as forms of hybrid warfare, and he regards civilian unarmed movements as equivalent to, say, armed resistance in Ukraine against the Russian invasion. Anywhere where you see the most use of these four adaptations is in countries that are the closest to the spheres of influence of Russia and China, for example, but we're also seeing them further afield as well. So the adaptations are this. First, they've learned how to prevent security force defections in particular. The second is that they have totally won the information war, and I'll explain what all of these mean. The third is that they use selective repression rather than kind of broad-based indiscriminate repression when they can to avoid that backfiring effect. And the fourth thing that they do is they engage in very obvious divide and rule strategies that many movements have not figured out yet how to adapt to. So the first of these adaptations is preventing security force defections. And they've done this in a few different ways. The first is to adapt in trainings, in army barracks, in officer training, in police academies all around the world, the information that the way that these color revolutions are going to win in our countries is by convincing you, our last defense, to stand out of the way. So don't do it. When a protester comes up to you and puts a rose in the barrel of your gun, just know that that person is a foreign agent and they're going to trick you, and you should just hold the line. And when we say repress, you repress. So that is a key part of the sort of knowledge system that is imparted now to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of security personnel around the world. The second piece that's an adaptation is more proactive payoffs to people within the inner entourage that are related to just increasing wages so that people feel satisfied with the professionalism of their role and choose not to defect. The third is fragmenting the security apparatus so that if any one group of people defect, it doesn't destroy the entire architecture of the security system. So for example, a key vulnerability in Egypt during the 2011 January uprising was that if there were sort of police and then there was the army, and if the army defected, they were sort of all going to go at once, which is ultimately what did happen there. But what is now the new innovation is that there are police, there's the army, there is the interior services, the intelligence services, there is a loyalist militia, there is a Praetorian Guard, and there are lots of different fragmented groups whose loyalty can be shored up or maintained in times of crisis. Repression, the most kind of brutal repression, is delegated only to the most loyal bodies. So for example, those that are less directly accountable to the population, elite forces, mercenaries, loyalist militias, or even allied troops are used instead of sending in, say, conscripts or police that come from the communities that people are protesting in as a way to avoid those defections. So for example, in Bahrain, when there was a mass uprising between 2011 and 2014, very large, something like 7% of the population was reported to be participating in this very extensive nonviolent movement. Instead of relying on Bahrain security forces, the Saudi security forces came in to shore them up. Purges are an age-old method of ensuring the loyalty of security forces, and they are being used worldwide. at a much greater clip. And then the direct repression of people who are disloyal to make a show of them to others is also used more broadly. So for example, when Bashar al-Assad was aware that Sunni conscripts were refusing to carry out massacres in civilian areas at the beginning of the Syrian uprising, he kept them in the barracks and instead sent out Alawi loyalists who were concentrated in the Air Force and Hezbollah and other loyalists to his regime. The impacts of this have been pretty decisive. If we look at the defection rates of security forces over the past couple of decades, it has been a pretty effective strategy. So the second element of the strategy is winning the information war. The rise of social media, in particular in digital technology, the integration of data into cell phones and computers, where it's now obvious what people's political viewpoints are, who they hang out with, where they're geolocated at any point of the day, who they call and who they text, what they eat, what they buy, what games they play, what they like to watch online, is all integrated in pieces of equipment that we voluntarily carry around in our pockets every day. This is kind of like the part that makes it a truly unprecedented time, is the degree to which the propaganda is voluntary rather than, or the sort of intelligence is voluntary rather than imposed. So the impacts of this is that it's never really a surprise when there is a mass mobilization. In fact, in East Germany, if you think about the Leipzig demonstrations, one of the things that scholars noticed is that there was what they called information cascades, that nobody actually knew, even the public didn't know, how widely hated the regime was until people started showing up in the square and saying things that everybody had thought but not said out loud. And then you get this massive explosion of mass mobilization. The state was totally overwhelmed. It was like 5 days. And then it begins to issue forth the literal fall of the Berlin Wall. So that's something that scholars call preference falsification, that in public you hide what your true preferences are. And it's only when you get these moments of common knowledge that everybody is on the same page. Now, we don't have much preference falsification right now. People tend to leave very clear digital trails of their preferences on social media, and even if they're not active on social media, just in their devices as a function of who they network with. And so it's never a surprise we don't get those same kind of information cascades that happened before. And then there are very powerful surveillance and intelligence gathering functions that social media in particular provide. So for example, in Sudan in 2011, there was an attempt at an Arab Spring. It was very short-lived. There were opposition activists who got together in Khartoum and started to plan something. Then there was somebody put on Facebook an event that looked like it was planned by the opposition. It was a really interesting graphic image, and it sort of called for people to come to a main square to protest at a given time and place. Some 17,000 people RSVP'd to come to the event. Some key organizers showed up at the beginning, and it was a trap. The site had been set up by the security forces. The people who came were arrested. Some were tortured. They got their Facebook passwords, and they knew who their network was. So it would be another, almost decade until the society was in a position to do something different. But it was a very difficult and sinister development that only showed what there is to come. The second way in which that autocrats have adjusted to the strategy is simply by trying to trash the information ecosystem with rumors, with speculation, with conspiracy theories, in ways that actually just make people want to totally disengage rather than engage. Using rhetoric like blaming foreigners and outsiders for the problems of the society, and then using doxing or mobbing to intimidate people is very common. Using internet shutdowns in a very sophisticated way has become part of the toolkit, but not in the ways you might think. So in Myanmar, for example, right when the civil disobedience movement rose up in the aftermath of the coup a couple of years ago, The government used technology that they got from the Chinese government to shut down the internet because Facebook was the primary way through which the opposition was organizing. However, they wouldn't keep it shut. They would reopen it and let people get back on to Facebook in key moments after news would be spreading about, say, the torture and killing of a very prominent and beloved poet. So they would turn it on long enough for people to find out the grisly way that he was killed, and then they would turn it off so that there wasn't an opportunity for there to be any effective communication, coordination, or mobilization, right? So actually it's using the availability of the internet to do the work of terrorizing the population rather than the sort of liberatory effects that people expected it to have in the old days. And then the fourth aspect is just dominating the information ecosystem by overtaking independent media or kicking out, blocking, or jailing independent media, streaming their own captured TV channels, using TV, radio, social media, cellular networks to push their own messages out in ways that's very difficult for opposition movements to sort of counteract without much more organization. So the third adaptation is trying to neutralize the backfire effect by avoiding indiscriminate attacks on unarmed people and instead using much more selective repression. So this is, first of all, always trying to just malign oppositionists and delegitimize them by calling them terrorists or coup plotters or traitors or foreign agents, and then putting them in jail rather than killing them. So it avoids the ability for there to be a martyrdom. They will often avoid very public demonstrations of violence and brutality where government forces themselves are in direct confrontation with the movement, but they will use selective terror or threats against key movement leaders, particularly delegated to those others, like mercenaries or death squads. And then the other interesting kind of development is the expansion of the use of kind of judicial processes and administrative and legislative tools to try to outlaw certain types of activities that have been widely accepted. For example, many of you who are in the sort of civic space world or human rights world know about the foreign agent laws that have been in place now for a decade or more in some countries that have made it incredibly difficult for independent organizations to sustain themselves. Now those laws are even used to accuse organizations who are not receiving foreign funding, but are engaged in work to promote democracy, and even they now have very shrinking space to engage in their work. Judicial coups, where there's the sort of quiet but very notable stacking of the judiciary with loyalists, cuts off independent legal remedy as another tool of these movements. And then the fourth element of this concerted strategy is very familiar, divide and rule. It's coming from actually trying to appropriate the toolkit of civil resistance and shoot it back at the West by encouraging autocratic movements and loyalist movements within autocracies to rise up and demonstrate their own legitimacy. Falling into this category would include election interference in the US and Estonia and Moldova and many different places around the world. China uses it in Taiwan, the Philippines, and elsewhere. And the idea is just to actually boomerang the effects of mobilization, but in this sense for autocratic reasons. The second thing that they do is they reinforce divisions within movements. Movements always are put together coalitions of sometimes odd couples or fair weather friends. And so if there are very obvious identity or ideological differences, it's not too hard if the movements haven't figured out how they want to negotiate that themselves to stoke those, make them more obvious and make them more destructive for the movements. The third thing is using agents provocateurs and infiltrators to encourage movements away from their own organizational discipline. And this is just basically encouraging them to be more radical or use more violent techniques so that it delegitimizes them and justifies greater government repression. They stoke more broadly identity-based conflicts, excuse me, which narrows the ability or precludes the ability of multi-ethnic, multi-class, multiracial, urban, rural, or gender solidarity to emerge more organically. And instead, those elements of civil society can sometimes be more narrow in their conception of their interests, and that also allows the autocrats to sort of reinforce their own narrow understanding of what nationhood means and citizenship means. And then finally, of course, unsurprisingly, they blame the most vulnerable for the ills of society. In the United States, this is undocumented immigrants, trans youth, and Black Americans. In Hungary, it's Muslim immigrants. In Russia, it's the LGBTQ community. You name it, they find a group that no one will stand up for, or that in recent attempts to stand up for them, it has backfired, and they will double down on that. So this all adds up to a quite formidable terrain and is all kind of the bad news. So let me go to some good news. The first element of good news is that this is a standard offering. And what that means is that it's extremely predictable at this point. I mean, you name a place in the world that is where people are trying to mobilize effectively together, and these things are all going on. It's a standard fare and has been for a number of years now. The second piece of good news is that there's growing awareness about the need for an upgrade in movement strategy, and that's happening simultaneously around the world. And the third piece of good news is that we don't have to really reinvent the wheel, because the same four core reasons why movements won in the past is basically why they're going to win now and in the future. However, it becomes more important to perform very well on all of those four dimensions. It's important not to improvise and hope for the best. And we need a bit of a 21st century refresh to deal with especially the sort of advantages that the digital environment has given to autocrats that movements have not yet found a way to adapt to. So let me share 6 things that I think will give us the upgraded playbook. And I'll walk through each of these in a bit of detail as well. The first is upgrading the new movement playbook by moving beyond the mass demonstration as the primary way that people do civil resistance. The second is thinking very carefully about strategy before tactics and actions. The third is investing more deeply in movement cohesion and big, broad coalitions. The fourth is exploiting novel technologies that are hard to adapt against. The fifth is innovating new media and new narratives. And the sixth is coordinating and sharing lessons. So on the first point, moving beyond the mass demonstration, some researchers have been noticing over the past few years that, that mass mobilization and mass participation, thank you, by itself isn't all that it cracked up to be, because autocrats have learned you can have a couple million people come to the streets, but if they don't stay there or do anything else, that they'll all get hungry, they'll get cold, they'll have to go and back to their normal lives, just wait it out, right? So big participation, mass demos doesn't really have the same political impact that it used to. My colleague Margarita Belgioso and I put together a study where we looked at what if you match participation with an increasing frequency of events taking place in a concentrated period of time. And we were inspired to look at this based on just the sheer insight from linear physics, that if you want momentum, you need mass and velocity. So if we think about mass participation as mass, and then we think about velocity as the number of events concentrated in the previous 7 days, what do we get? And what we got is a very good predictor of an incumbent autocrat leaving office on any given day. And what this chart is showing you is that as the numbers of events in the previous week increase, conditional on how many people have mobilized on any given day, on that day in the country, you're seeing a very good kind of predictive performance of whether someone leaves. So it's not just participation, it's momentum. Building momentum and having strategies to build momentum is very important. The second piece is about the ability to actually think what you're going to do with that momentum when you get it. So I would say that there's sort of 3 strategies that we're comparing in this very messy slide, which I'm showing you because it's important and I'll explain it. This slide is based on a computational model that Andrew Hawking, and Zoe Marks published a couple of years ago, where we're comparing three strategies. The first is what you would call mass mobilization strategy. That is, get as many people as you can into the streets as quickly as you can and hope for the best. And that's mostly what we see around the world, frankly. The second strategy is what we call a naive pillar strategy. And what this means is, instead of just going everywhere and hoping for the best, people try to mobilize near their closest pillar of society. So like the economic elite or security force that's closest to them, and they make a lot of noise and hope that that person defects. The informed pillar strategy, which is the third strategy, is where what they do is they have some intelligence about which of the pillars is already the most likely to defect. They know something about their personal preferences. And so they go to that one first. And they try to get those low-hanging fruit early, and then they hope that that creates a defection cascade. Because what we're talking about with movements winning is them having a defection cascade. So let's look at the impacts of that. The black line that's right, kind of the linear line, is the historical record. So what we're trying to do is build a strategy that outperforms that. The horizontal axis is peak participation in the movement, and the vertical axis is the probability of success. So what you're seeing there with the blue lines is the typical strategy of get as many people as you can, as early as you can, and hope for the best. And the way to interpret this is it works if it works, which is to say, if you actually get a ton of people quickly, you can see that it performs as well as the other strategies. The problem is something like 95% of the observations never get there. They just can't get that many people that fast. And so it's very risky. If you go with the naive pillar strategy, that's the red line, and that's where you mobilize as many people as you can close to a pillar. You don't know anything about their preferences, but you go there and you try to get them to defect. That's already outperforming the historical record, even at the smallest numbers. Then if you look at the green line, that is your informed pillar strategy. That's where you go where somebody you think might be likely to defect is going to be, and you get them to defect, and that initiates the cascade. And that one is succeeding at incredibly high historical levels, even with very small numbers. What does this suggest? It suggests that movements need a lot more capacity to get information about who thinks what, who is connected to whom, and who might be disloyal early in a campaign. And so that requires all kinds of capacities. It also requires them to broaden their understanding of which pillars matter, moving away from security forces, which have been largely coup-proofed, and into economic and business elites, civil servants, and the other types of pillars who are available to movements when security forces aren't. They should also think about going beyond coercion. That is, going behind the model of just shouting loudly outside of people's houses or things, and think about quiet and covert methods of eliciting those loyalty shifts: persuasion, fraternization, pressure. There are lots of different mechanisms for this that become available. The third element of a new strategy would be investing in movement cohesion. And this has really three prongs. The first is accepting the necessity of leadership, moving away from improvised or leaderless resistance, and really leaning into having a deep pool of people who can rise to the occasion and lead a movement, no matter what happens. The second piece that is related to the principle of cohesion is really coming to some kind of common vision and agreement before any mobilization takes place at all, and negotiating those types of things so that as internal conflict arises, there's a process for dealing with it. And then third, I think developing an organizational infrastructure that is more like umbrella organizations or large broad-based coalitions, as opposed to each little civic organization for itself, will help to ensure that if these changes do take place, there are viable democratic alternatives for what follows them. The fourth innovation would be exploiting novel technologies, and what is up here is a list of ways that AI could be helpful to social movements that was given to me by ChatGPT when we typed in, how can AI be helpful to social movements? These are some of the ideas it produced. And guess what? They solve some of the problems that I just laid out of building capacity to better understand what the opposition power map is, who might be the most likely to defect based on public statements that they've made, financial relationships that they have, various interests that are publicly known, and that could be synthesized into a power map. Interestingly, AI can do a lot with data analysis techniques like documentation of human rights abuses or electoral fraud that have been very difficult for movements to do themselves because it's simply too dangerous. Algorithms can be developed with not a lot of time or effort that can detect all kinds of anomalous behavior without putting anyone's life at risk. There are all kinds of tools that can be built for crisis response. There are many different, very easy tools for strategic and tactical planning to where people can make mistakes with the AI in conversation that they don't have to make mistakes about in real life. For example, if you go into ChatGPT and you start having a question about a conversation about, here's my plan for whatever social movement you're involved in, what's wrong with it, where are the flaws, it'll tell you. It'll tell you what it thinks the flaws are. You can have an active back and forth. This is something that is much lower risk than getting out there and trying and failing and trying and failing. The fifth big innovation will be around actually fighting on the media space, rather than just allowing it to be completely overtaken by autocratic forces. So this involves innovating new media or using new media that is very attractive, especially to young people or people who are more doubtful about democracy, in building narratives into it that are irresistible. And there are two ways to think about irresistible narratives. The first is channeling the obvious anti-establishment sentiment that exists around the world right now into some kind of genuinely constructive and hopeful program, one that isn't about scapegoating, but is about building a bigger we, where prosperity is shared with everyone and the like, and then focusing on building more of a positive coalition rather than a negative one. One of the things that's been true about movements over the last 20 years is they've been very good at being anti-something, but not as good at being pro-something. And so this is partly because they've been disconnected from deep organizational bases. But again, if movements spend more time building those broad-based coalitions and big tents under umbrellas, then they will have to do this work, and it will be to their benefit. Because then whatever victories they obtain are going to last. And then finally, we should be doing much more of what the autocrats have been doing when it comes to coordinating and sharing lessons with each other. There are way more of us than there are of them, yet we don't know yet how to act like a global majority. So I think we should start to act like a global majority, and what we should do is really invest in trainings and strategy convenings for activists around the world. We should build a global network of people who are committed to minimal kind of definitions of democracy and their supporters, and we should work hard to learn from each other about what is working and what isn't. And then we should have a kind of an observatory approach to collecting data on where wins are happening and where losses are happening so that we can really have a lively feedback loop of knowledge to practice. So there is evidence for hope. As I mentioned, there's a growing awareness of need for a strategic upgrade. Everywhere around the world where we've seen autocratic consolidation taking place, we've also seen everyday forms of resistance, which belie an enduring oppositional spirit and the capacity of people to engage in collective action to change their circumstances no matter what. And then I'd also say we sort of have to do these things because there's no alternative to not trying. I think Rebecca Solnit, who I often read, was talking about the protests that happened around the world to try to prevent the United States from invading Iraq in 2003. And she said a lot of people like to say that those protests completely failed because the US invaded Iraq, and it led to disastrous consequences for everyone in the world, I would argue. However, the fact that the protests happened might have saved lives. It can delay an invasion, which I think probably in this case it likely did. It can create dissent among advisors that has to be sorted out, and that can give people time to flee. It also shows that power isn't just going to be unchecked by everyone, and it shows that there are political costs to engaging in disastrous adventures. And I think that should be true today, too. We shouldn't always just focus on defeats as examples of how things aren't working. We should ask ourselves what we prevented from happening by the fact we stood up when we needed to. So there are people doing this. The World Liberty Congress is an example. This is drawn from their website. It's a group of a few hundred activist leaders who've convened from 60 countries over the past couple of years to begin to share lessons about the way that the sort of new autocratic alliance has been interfering with their ambitions and aspirations for democracy. And we're going to see more of this every day. So with that, I'm going to stop and thank you again and look forward very much to our conversation.
Thank you for that thought-provoking, sobering, and I guess moderately optimistic as well address, Erica. We'll be hearing more from you and from the panel very soon, but first we have a musical interlude by the fabulous band, one of my favorites, nummer 4.
Honored to be here. We never speak in English, so this is feels like a big opportunity for us. Even though I guess many of you are Norwegian, I'm using this opportunity to speak a little English. Unfortunately, all of our songs is in Norwegian, so yeah, I can't translate them. That would take too much time. But the first one, er det alt feil? Yeah. The first one is about trying our best and feeling like we never get it right. Each time it goes wrong, for someone at least, when we do our best. Yes. Okay.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Feil vei, galt svar, dumt gjort, hva var det jeg sa? Gi opp, ikke snu, vær deg selv, hør på meg, ta deg sammen når du går lei. Følg ditt hjerte, bruk ditt hode, ha is i magen, les, men ikke tro det. Sett spor, men ikke ta for mye plass. Vær med, du kan det, følg med, du skal det, smil, du må det, du skal det, du kan det. Vi gjør alle så godt vi kan, og vi gjør alt feil. Og vi gjør alt feil, vi gjør alt feil, vi gjør alt feil. Stakkar deg, stakkar han, som elsket henne, hun som aldri fant fram. Og alle de som snubler, stakkar dem som vil forsones, de som slåss, de som glemmer, stakkars oss. Vær med, du kan det. Følg med, du skal det, smil, du må det, du skal det, du kan det. Vi gjør alle så godt vi kan, og vi gjør alt feil, vi gjør alt feil, vi gjør alt feil, vi gjør alle så godt vi kan, og vi gjør alt feil, vi gjør alt feil. Rykke tilbake til start igjen, prøver å rydde opp igjen. Vi begynner på nytt igjen, og gjør samme feil igjen. Vi gjør alle så godt vi kan, og og kanskje vi får det til en gang iblant, før vi går feil vei. Vi gjør alle så godt vi kan, og vi gjør alt feil. Vi gjør alt feil, vi gjør alt feil. Vi gjør alle så godt vi kan, og vi gjør alt feil. Vi gjør alt feil.
Thank you. Okay, we have 2 more songs on the program. I was ordered to tell you from my friend. She's very
nervous of using your time. No.
The next one is about important relationships in our lives, whoever that is, and they are fantastic to have, but also a bit exhausting. Demanding. And it's called Det finnes bare vi. No, I'm not going to translate it. I won't. Det finnes bare vi.
Hemmelig, det du skal si, det blir mellom deg og meg. Jeg følger med, mine tårer triller ned, og jeg ler når du vil jeg skal le. Jeg passer på alle dine tanker, store og små, jeg bærer de med hvor enn vi går. Og jeg er enig med deg der, og alt det du sier, det tror jeg på, eller prøver å forstå. Og jeg tror på ditt parti, og ønsker å si det du vil jeg skal si. Jeg er her til alt er forbi, for det finnes ingen meg uten deg. Alt jeg er sammen med deg. Det finnes ingen meg uten deg. Alt jeg er sammen med deg. Umulig å komme nærmere enn vi. Det finnes ingen luft, bare lim. Det finnes ingen luft, bare lim. Det finnes bare vi. Og jeg skal følge deg, grave meg ned med deg, være helt og skurk, svak og sterk, vinne og tape med deg. For du er enig med meg, og alt det jeg sier, det tror du på, eller prøver å forstå. Og du er tro på mitt parti, og ønsker å si det jeg vil du skal si. Jeg er her til alt er forbi, for det finnes ingen meg uten deg. Alt jeg er sammen med deg. Det finnes ingen meg uten deg. Alt jeg er sammen med deg. Det finnes ingen meg uten deg. Alt jeg er sammen med deg. Det finnes ingen meg uten deg.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the last song is about feeling homesick in a way, and that sometimes, especially here in Norway, it could be a long way home, and maybe not that long, but a bit
Geography
crooked.
is crooked.
Yes. And it's called liten stort. Little and big. That was easy.
Den tok du.
Yeah.
Bredt og smalt og langt og kort, lit og stort er landet vårt. Og for noen er det langt fremme. Men uansett hvor langt det er, bratt og glatt og mørkt det er, så venter det noe der. I et lite hus i en liten by, en gård på et helt umulig øde sted. Vi finner frem til det, for vi trosser vind og regn og snø og storm og flom og sjø og fjell og lyn og kø og sånn for å komme oss hjem. Og uansett om du er her eller der, er verdens navle der du er. Så kom deg hjem, kom deg videre, kom deg frem. Kom deg dit du er deg selv, så kom deg hjem, kom deg videre, kom deg frem, kom deg hjem. Høyt og lavt og grønt og blått, kaldt og varmt er landet vårt, og vi lengter alle hjem. Hver uke eller nå dag, en gang iblant hver eneste dag. Det er litt til og fra, for det er godt å være for seg selv og få litt avstand og puste og kjenne og føle på hvor godt det er å savne noen nå, som alle våre koner, fedre, sønner, venner, brødre, hunder, katter, TV, bestemødre. De lengter nok de år. Og uansett hvor du er verdens navle der de er. Så kom deg hjem, kom deg videre, kom deg frem, kom deg dit du er deg selv. Så kom deg hjem, kom deg videre, kom deg hjem. Så dra på kryss og tvers og langs og opp og ned, og att og fram og langt og like ved. Reis bort og vekk og fra og til og mot og skrått og rett og rundt og uten og med. Bredt og smalt og langt og kort, lit og stort er landet vårt.
Tusen takk for oss. Thank you.
Julia, nummer 4. We are exceptionally glad you agreed to play for us today. We will now proceed to the conversation with our esteemed speaker, and joining me for this conversation with Professor Erica Chenoweth are Raymond Johansen and Dr. Håkon Gjerløv. Raymond Johansen is the Secretary General of the Norwegian People's Aid, the NPA. He is the former Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, a former State Secretary at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and most recently the former governing mayor of the city of Oslo for the Labour Party. Dr. Håkon Gjerløv is a senior researcher at PRIO. His research focuses on political institutions, mass mobilization, and human development. He is currently leading a Norwegian Research Council-funded project on political elites in electoral autocracies, and has recently published a co-authored report funded by the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD, on success factors of mass mobilization and democratic change. So please take the stage. And I will start with you, Raymond. You are leading one of the organizations that will hopefully contribute to save democracy. No pressure. The Norwegian People's Aid, the NPA, is part of this broad coalition of organizations that are fundamental for democracy. Among the very explicit ambitions of the Norwegian People's Aid, the international work that you're doing, is political change to empower marginalized groups and popular mobilization for democratic participation and political rights. And having listened to Erica now, how do you see the Norwegian People's Aid's contributions to supporting global democracy?
Well, first I think that a high-regarded academic like Erica, they gave us really a boost in self-confidence by their one-liner when they say that civil society can save, improve democracy. And ordinary people, they have to attend, and we can renew global democracy. And that's exactly what we try to do. As you rightly mentioned, that NPA, which was founded in 1939, out from the Norwegian labor movement, as a international solidarity organization. And that's important, and because also through our history, it's a history of building a welfare state, and it was the civil society was an important partner in building this welfare state, and including the labor movement, it was also the civil society that was behind this. And the main thing for NPA to contribute to, it's by strengthening the power of people's organization and movements. That's important. Last week, I was in South Sudan and in Kenya. And I think using Sudan as an example is very relevant to what they are saying. With the 2019 revolution, it was really a recipe for how well-organized civil society player. They played with street protest, mass mobilization to topple the regime, and they succeed. They were able to kick Bashir out of his office, and it was the strength of the civil society movements that make this possible. It showed us that the Sudan revolution was a recipe for how well-organized civil society played along with street protest and mass mobilization to topple the regime, and lesson also of its limitations, facing a military regime. And now both RSF and SAF, the military leaders, who witnessed the power of the people by the way that they actually organize, try to make sure that this will never happen again. It's a war against the values of the revolution, striking down on any attempt of pro-democracy and anti-war campaign. So for us to continue also under these circumstances, to find ways of supporting the civil society. No, it's an extremely dramatic situation in Sudan. It's 13 million IDPs and 100,000 killed. And then find ways to to support the civil society. And by funding them, which is, of course, extremely difficult. But it's possible to find their ways, and therefore, and now I'm more practical, to actually support the civil society under these circumstances. It requires long-term and flexible funding. And this is important for us to tell them. And it's also one other very important thing, which also Erica indirectly mentioned. It's easy to do a lot of harm. Therefore, do no harm to civil society. They have to set their own agenda. It's not an agenda coming from other donors, other countries. It needs to be their own agenda that we have to support. Therefore, it's difficult also to find ways to generate money, but we try to do that. This is one example that it was a civil society not strong enough towards the military regime, but it was there strong enough to rule out President Bashir. The other thing now is in South Sudan. It's very volatile regime which is there now, and for us also there to support the civil society, which we have done. Now the civil society, they are actors which attend the ongoing peace negotiations in the so-called Tumaini process. And we are very proud to be a supporter for the civil society so that they can be a clear voice around that table to support their agenda. It will take a long time to reach a peaceful solution in South Sudan, but that we do. And then we have other examples which we have done previously to support the Farmers Union, other organizations in Guatemala, which already existing. They have a stronger civil society compared to Sudan. And I think that the strong support of all the different civil society organizations in Guatemala had been a prerequisite for the new regime in Guatemala that now are hopefully heading in a better direction. So we are proud of supporting the civil society, although it's dark times. It's extremely difficult. We see situations in Ukraine and in the Middle East today, which is another side of the coin, which is more difficult to support them these days. Although, also in Gaza, we have supported the civil society, the Farmers Union, the Fishery Union, and other organizations, which are there also during the war. They are there. And of course, under extremely difficult conditions, and they're forced to flee many, many times.
I want a quick follow-up question, because we heard when Erica did the presentation that there is a lot of movements around, but there is declining success. Do you see in the interactions that you have with your partners that there is any sort of lower sense of urgency, lower sort of sense of commitment, or are people enthusiastic about making these kinds of contributions, of engaging?
I think we all suffer from donor fatigue. That's definitely extremely complicated. We see it in many European countries. We don't know what will happen in US these days, but that's also the part of the right-wing agenda, because they are very skeptical towards foreign aid, to immigration, And therefore also it's easy to say that they want to reduce the foreign aid and the assistance. So it's because you not can clearly tomorrow see if that's very helpful. To building a society, it's not, you need to have a long-term thinking. And therefore also the donor community need to be patient and believe the importance of supporting the civil society. So it's difficult, and we don't want to be that visible, because it's our partners that have to be visible. And therefore, also towards the donor community, what are you doing? Well, we are strengthening the civil society, and we are not doing that tomorrow. So having a conference like this, with an academic like Erica, it's also very important that the donor, the foreign ministry, NORAD, and elsewhere in Europe are more conscious about that this is long-term commitment. It requires a long-term commitment.
Håkon, I'll turn to you now. You have a long record of studying democratization, political institutions, mass mobilization. What are, in your view, the key factors that have contributed to the rise of authoritarianism, and how have they evolved in the last decade? And what is your take on Erica's emphasis on the role of civil society?
That's a big question. Well, first I have to say that thank you very much for a great lecture, Erica. I think it was able to synthesize a lot of the different literatures into a coherent framework, which is a quite difficult task. So I recognize a lot of the topics that we study, and when it comes to regimes as well, in what we were talked about. So I think I'll address your question, Henrik, by dividing into two different types of situations. So we could be talking about civil resistance against autocratic rule and the effort to try to establish democracy. But I think what's on many people's minds right now is existing democracy and attacks against existing democracy and the role in trying to not establish it, but just trying to defend it. And that's a very different type of process. So one of the things that has been happening over the past decade-ish is that a lot of these democracies, they face what we call autogolps, which is a word I don't know why we landed on that word. I don't understand what it means, but it's a self-coup. It's a leader who attacks the judicial system or the media landscape, somehow autocratizes a democratic framework. Hungary would be a typical example that many of us would think of. Of course, also a lot of people fear what Trump could possibly do to the American system. These are autogolps, and they face us with it's not the only way regimes break down. We have some classic old school autocratization as well. We have some military coups. West Africa recently has been solid ground for military coups. So it's not the only game in town, but it's one of the new, or at least a type of regime attack on democracy that we haven't seen in a long time. And this poses a much more difficult question to us, because then the question becomes, why do we as voters vote for people who would do this? And that's a much more scary question to engage with. And this is what a lot of scholars are now trying to grapple with. How do we end up voting for these people? Right now, one agenda that is gaining a lot of attention is, okay, so we'll set it up as an experiment. You get two candidates. Let's say that we'll take the context of Norway. You have one candidate that would really improve the welfare state, will save everyone from the dangers of old age and everything. They'll really invest in the welfare state. But in order to do that, they have to crack down on the media, because the media is so critical to what they're doing, etc. We have some other candidate who would really just remove the welfare state, think it's way too much money being spent into the welfare state, but they will defend democracy with nebb and klør, as we say in Norwegian, right? So you end up in this trade-off where I personally would like to see the welfare state, but in order to vote for that, I have to vote for someone that's attacking democracy. For me to defend democracy, I would have to vote for someone who argues for something I don't want. And that puts us in a trade-off. And the more polarized a society becomes, let's talk about abortion, LGBTQ in Poland, these types of issues, the bigger the distance between these two candidates, the more expensive this trade-off becomes, right? And voters care more about these substantial policy issues than defending democracy. At least a substantial amount of voters care more about the substantial policy and not sufficiently about democracy. They care about democracy, but not as much as they care about welfare state or immigration or inflation or whatever. And that's a huge issue. And it plays into what Erica was talking about, particularly about information, controlling the information environment. One thing the autocrats is doing is trying to polarize these issues exactly to increase this trade-off, increase the chaos in the policy space. So this is a much more difficult, or to my mind, I don't have a clear answer to how the civil society should respond to this. An excellent PhD I'm supervising, Amalie Nielsen, is working on topics related to how perhaps these protest movements could change the sentiments. So we're doing various studies into how, by being confronted with protest movements, maybe we are able to convince people to defend democracy or somehow change their preferences. But there's also the potential that mass mobilization just increases polarization because the stakes becomes higher. There's more what we call negative partisanship, or where you increase, you blame some outgroup, be it the Republicans, the immigrants, or whatever, some outgroup for your problems, making it more difficult to establish conversation across partisan divides. And this, I think, is a huge. This is a difficult task to tackle. So, going to the original question that Erica was dealing with, can civil society save us? I want to say, I also want to say yes, but I want to say yes, but not alone. And by that I mean that in dealing with the attacks on democracy, you have to be a part of this civil society. You actually have to engage in these conversations to help us avoid this polarization and try to bridge the divide.
Erica, I want to take the advantage of having you here only 1 week after the U.S. presidential elections, and of course many now are claiming that they all foresaw Trump's victory. You actually wrote a report 2 years back saying what we should do in case this happens. So you have, you have a bit of a track record when it comes to seeing this coming. But what can we learn? I mean, are there also some takeaway points when it comes to civil society mobilization in the U.S., that can tell us something about democratic resilience, how we handle, challenges to democratic participation in the U.S. with respect to voter suppression, foreign influence? What's your take now, 1 week after?
Yeah. Well, sorry, I'm coughing right on cue. So a couple of things about the U.S. election. The first is that I wouldn't overread too much the way that this is a departure in the United States from what's been going on since 2016. So on the one hand, the electoral map is exactly the same, more or less, as it was in 2016. And the 2020 electoral map was so unique because it was the middle of a pandemic and it was easier to vote in 2020 in the United States than ever in the history of the country. People were mailed ballots and could mail them back, and there was a huge proportion of voters who were one-time in their life voters. The turnout was not as good in this election as most people expected, and turnout is kind of an indicator of enthusiasm. And the problem was that Kamala Harris was an incumbent candidate, or was thought of as an incumbent candidate, and because she was part of the existing government, she couldn't be too hard on its inability to raise the minimum wage, to address the voter who is mostly worried about wage stagnation and things along those lines. And so, this was, as every other election in the world has been this year in every single country in the world, this was an election where the incumbent party lost vote share. Right, left, and center, every country in the world who's had an incumbent running for re-election or an incumbent party that's been in an election, they've lost vote share. And so that's just part of our system right now in the world, strong economic headwinds and an anti-establishment wave boosted, I think, by COVID and its sort of knock-on effects. So that said, the majority of Americans, the part that did surprise me is that the majority of voters voted for Trump this time. So that's unlike 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and Trump won the electoral vote. In this election, he won the plurality. I will point out, however, that because of low turnout, what he really did was he won 28% of the electorate. And Kamala Harris won about 26.5% of the electorate. And the remaining voters voted for third parties or write-ins. We didn't have very good turnout, right? So I still insist that the majority of Americans value and care about and would prioritize democracy, but many of them couldn't bring themselves to show up and vote in this election. And so that speaks to the second part of your question, which is, what do we learn about the role of civil society here? Well, to be honest, there just wasn't a lot of civil society mobilization happening in advance of this election, at least not to get people to vote or anything along those lines. $1 billion that was raised in the last month of this campaign by the Democratic Party largely went into ads, not into get out the vote, or chasing down all of those absentee ballots that were cast in 2020 and making sure those people get to the polls again. That wasn't really what happened. The American population is sort of weary of the palace intrigue. And, Joe Biden was deeply unpopular, is deeply unpopular, and has been since 2021. He was never able to recover his popularity since the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. That's when it dropped. And September of 2021 has never come up, even as inflation has gone down, even as he's passed historic economic progressive legislation, invested in infrastructure and everything else. And it's sort of classic boom and bust stuff. Trump way overheated the economy and during his time, but Americans didn't feel the economic pain of that until Biden was the president. And he spent his presidency trying to climb out of a recession, and Trump is going to inherit an economy that's in pretty darn good shape. So what now? Well, who knows? I think most people do expect him to follow through on his campaign promises of tariffs, of massive deportations, all of which will combine to inflict enormous economic pain on Americans and everyone else. And so I just think, this was a good example of where civil society kind of sat this one out. I think largely from just weariness of it, and from just, basically a sense that neither party was really going to deliver on the things that a lot of Americans care about. And so all of the enthusiasm was on the Trump side. And that's why we saw what we saw. Going forward, the way I would describe American civil society is quite radicalized on the right and fragmented everywhere else. And so what will be needed in the United States is basically the things I said will be needed everywhere. There will be there will be a necessary effort to really sew together and weave together what has been a very fragmented civil society at the grass tops and at the grassroots. They will need to address the issue that Håkan just mentioned, which is that people retreat very quickly into their partisan corners when confronted with the trade-off for whether to support democracy or whether to get their way. And so in the very long term, we have to really kind of reinvigorate civic education and just the spreading of the norms that are required to sustain a healthy democracy over time. perhaps a common peril will induce people to that level of cooperation. I think that the United States, as I said, probably the majority of Americans care about this issue and may care more about it in the coming months and years. The good news is Trump is about to be the incumbent. We're still in an anti-incumbent wave in a few years, and we're still voting in the United States, then we'll have another shot.
And do you think, the current situation could actually trigger more of a sort of cohesive social, responsibility? See the movements sort of coming together as a result of that?
Yeah, although I would expect it to look different than it did in 2016. In 2016, there was massive mobilization early, and it was largely an expression of shock and anger. It was tactically organized, but not strategically organized. And people just hit the streets, right? And kind of stayed in the streets at historic levels throughout his presidency. I don't think we're going to see that this time. And I think that's probably correct because he's learned the same thing everybody else has learned. Just you can deal with street protests, just ignore them or, whatever. He's promised actually to send the U.S. military out after protesters. And I think what's needed everywhere is sort of taking a minute and instead of, hitting the streets without a broader strategy, build that coalition. Come up with that positive program that's going to be irresistible, even among those who are against the establishment. Negotiate the differences that have kept our civil society very fragmented and competitive rather than cooperative, and really build that power from which then you can do mobilization that will actually, translate into political leverage and power.
Raymond, I wanted to follow up on an important point that you made about doing no harm, because as we saw, with an increasing mobilization on one level and the willingness of people to take to the streets at the same time as there is an increasing ability on many autocratic governments to crack down, to put people behind bars, to torture. How does that play out in the way that you're engaging? How do you sort of talk to the partners that are receiving this kind of aid? What do you do in order to concretely try to avoid that civil society organizations are ending in harm's way?
That's secret. Of course, we need to be extremely careful. It's you. Here they mention a lot of available new communication, so it's possible to reach these people, to reach this organization within a country, and for VIPs, as we say, came to Africa 10 years before it come to Norway, so it finds a lot of ways to continue to support them and also have a dialogue, which we do in many of these countries. And unfortunately, a lot of them are also in exile. So then we are supporting them. But what I mentioned by do no harm, it has to be their agenda that we actually support to strengthen and build the civil society. It's not driven from us or from other donors. That's very important. But what we say now in many, especially in many African countries, before, I think in the 70s, a lot of the center left wing, we supported a lot of the liberation movements in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in Sudan, in Angola, in Mozambique. But now we see that they were not able to build any civil society. It's usually a military thinking. So our old friend have become the new dictatorship in their country. So now, and they know the strength of the civil society. They know that from the struggle. So then they are very afraid of the strength of the civil society. So it's important for them to really knock that down. We see it clearly in many of these countries that I mentioned these days. So we have contact. we do and support them, what they need from us. And that's often to help them to facilitate meeting. The emergency room, for example, in Sudan, which is important to have different meetings because it's also a kind of preparedness. If democracy will prevail, then they have created a civil society, which was not the case during our support to the liberation movements in the 70s and 80s. They were not a strong civil society. They were the ones that we actually support. No, this is a part of the preparedness for democracy, to have a kind of reliable civil society. So that's important, although it's extremely difficult. But we see succeed. I'm sure that we have seen some success in Latin America. And I think it's also, in these days, it's very important because now, mainly in Norway, in Europe, in US, and elsewhere, we are just talking about military means. More support to the military, now 2% in Norway, which I can understand because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. But at the same time, we need to continue to believe in strengthening civil society, in people-to-people cooperation, in foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, and to strengthen the civil society for them to be prepared. And that's extremely difficult these days, but it's necessary.
Håkon?
Yeah, so I think there's an interesting tension here for a country like Norway that want to help around the world. We've been talking about this today. So if you look at a country and you see that some autocrat is trying to crack down on civil society, and then you're like, we got to scramble, we got to help out the civil society, you're already late to the party, right? So the investing in civil society is something you have to do in peacetime when things aren't rough, to build up the resilience of these civil society organizations so that they are ready when there is a window of opportunity, or ready when they are being cracked down on. But that also means that, for a country like Norway, they'll be investing in civil societies around the world, and a lot of these areas will never see such a window of opportunity. Maybe only a handful of them. So you have to do a very broad investment only to be ready in those few hotspots where something occurs. And that's a very difficult investment strategy, thinking of this as an investment from Norwegian side. Yeah.
But it's not always that costly to do it. It's often also the cheapest way to actually support. It's a lot of seed money. And you just need to choose and find the right channel to actually support them. That's important, but of course to find the right partners. That can be difficult, but I think that's the only way forward, to find ways to strengthen the civil society.
Erica, from your experience working with both donor community but also organizations, I know you're also worried about this do no harm and how we're trying to engage without risking too much. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the general idea that people have to be the ones on the ground determining what risks they're willing to take and not willing to take in order to create the changes they want, and how to prioritize that, et cetera. And so I'm always very measured in how I talk about different strategies and the ways that they can be used in different places. And I try very hard not to project that if you just do X, Y, and Z, you'll win. Like just go in the streets and get huge numbers, and it will, a magic wand will be waved and you'll win. I think there's no such thing as a formula, but there are sets of strategies and ways of thinking and a theory of change that drives what we know about how civil society can bring about or defend democracy. And that set of really questions that civil society leaders need to ask themselves is something that we can, I think, broadly share without doing harm. I think that the biggest harm that a person like myself could do inadvertently would be like, just projecting that this is easy, right? And the reality is most people know it isn't. So it's more just trying to help guide and shape the types of questions that people might ask themselves to be fully informed about what we know about it and how that can be helpful to them.
If you made a very good point, Erica, during your presentation about social media. If we go back 10 years, the discussion we had was, how amazing the use of social media, how liberating a technology that was, how it would change in a way that people can mobilize. And now we see that the autocrats have been, getting the upper hand, both using and surveilling and preventing people from using social media. At the same time, we're all enthusiastic about, as you noted, the way that we can use AI as hopefully a liberating technology. It would be useful to hear sort of, and I know you have a lot of very interesting thoughts about this, but and to say a little bit more about how AI can, be the next or help the next wave of democratization and mobilization. But I also wanted to ask you, what does ChatGPT tell us about how movements can now use social media in a good way for promoting democracy? Is that is that something of the past? Are there ways that we can use social media still to make progress?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not typed that prompt into ChatGPT, but any of you could and find out what it says, and it would tell you something a little different from what it tells me, which is one of the interesting things about it. So I'm a big social media skeptic for a couple of reasons. The first is that I think that it gives people a false sense of effectiveness around coordination and communication, even when it's on messages that are encrypted and that sort of thing, in part because it's always limited just by the nature of the business model to the people you'd already be talking to. I think offline cooperation, coordination, and discussion is much more effective. It's better at building trust, and it's less vulnerable to surveillance. It's also less vulnerable to building the sense of we have like so many people liking our posts and thinking that you're more kind of popular than you are. Like encountering people on a daily basis in person gives you that reality check of how far your movement has to go that an online presence necessarily wouldn't. And the other piece is just like, honestly, it's either, there's sort of two types of social media. There's the type that is built by and run by autocrats. And then there's the type that is built by and run by totally unaccountable tech companies that are the richest companies in the history of humanity, that are so powerful that they are unaccountable and unregulatable. And, we're their products, right? Not their users. We are the products. We are the ones they are selling. And so I just think that, that relying on a set of tools like that is just inherently dangerous, especially because increasing governments will be using just shutdowns to prevent people from relying on it. If they don't have well-established communications channels outside of that, it's just going to be bad news. So in terms of AI, I mean, AI is also run by the most powerful companies, the richest companies in the world, and it has some differences from social media, which is that people can interact with and engage with and even write tools using relatively widely available open source material that can help them to solve some difficult strategic and organizational problems that would otherwise be very risky for them to do it. And so this is all about tools that movements can appropriate that can limit some of their risks and get them some advantages that they've lost by governments appropriating, especially the networked media. AI is not networked. It is something that somebody could open on their computer on a VPN and have a private conversation with. that's anonymous, right? And so I just think that is a different kind of technology that people have been afraid to engage with, and I would like to have a more systematic, broader conversation about how it can be useful for movements.
Yeah, I think, of course, the social media can be very important for the mass mobilization. But the mass mobilization itself, it's not enough. Because you need organization that see the results from the mass mobilization to take it further. That's the key. If not, it just will be happening of a mass mobilization. Then you need to cooperate, maybe with political parties. You need to organize. Then if you have a strong labor movement, then they will take it forward. So the mass mobilization, the social media itself, it's good, bringing people together, but then you need a stronger civil society, as we have had here in Norway, to see the clear results of it, to bring it forward. That's really the essence of supporting and strengthen the civil society so they can play an important role.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say on this note, exactly, like I could go out on Twitter right now and say, hey everyone, I'm in Oslo. Tomorrow we're going to have a big protest outside the main train station about XYZ issue. And I promise we could get like 5,000 people to come, right? We really could. We could do that together now. And what would it do about that issue? Nothing. It would show we could get 5,000 people to come out in less than 24 hours. And it shows nothing more than that. And so this is the adaptation I've been talking about. Like they realize numbers alone don't matter. They, meaning the autocrats, movements are still in a numbers alone matter mindset. And so we have to get out of that mindset.
Håkon?
Yeah, but this will just be another agreement. I also think I think it kind of just highlights the trade-off we're just not willing to make. That we rather want the gains of social media, even though we know that they are run by autocrats or highly susceptible, or what do you call it, dangerous big tech companies. And I think Erica just loves AI because AI is just trained on, it's trained on text that is out there. Yeah. And Erica has defined a lot of this literature, so it's probably just giving Erica's literature back to her. Wow, this is so great. It's so smart.
The first time I got turned on to it, it was because a student came to me and said, I put into ChatGPT, I asked the question, what's more wise, nonviolent or violent resistance, and it literally like summarized my research on the topic, and I was like, that thing is pretty damn smart.
But given how much you've written, Erica, it's going to be hard for the autocrats to catch up with that. One of my concerns is when it comes to sort of this development, and when I speak to people. If we see the declining, trends in democracy, we see the challenge with social movements not being successful. That the coming generation, the youth, will lose interest in, lose hope in democracy. We had a great peace address a few years back by Haji Sharif and Ilvan Elman that you can all listen to online. But I also wanted to get your sense of this, Erica, about how, and I guess for the rest of you as well, how can we, what strategies do we have? How can we, encourage the coming generations to step up and participate and not lose faith in the possibility that we can build democratic societies again?
Yeah, I mean. There's a really interesting book by a sociologist named James Jasper, and the book is called The Emotions of Protest. And in it, he sort of says that in order to have a real viable and sustainable social movement, what you need is a combination of two collective emotions. One is anger, and the other is hope. But if you just have anger, you don't get anything other than just a very resigned, demobilized population. Same for fear. But if you do anger plus hope, which is like you're giving people a sense of agency and efficacy, then you can see all kinds of very interesting collective action, mobilization, et cetera. And so that's part of why I'm increasingly convinced by the need to spell out what the alternatives are. So if you don't love what you've gotten in the United States over the past 4 years, Americans, wait until you get a hold of this. Like, it's going to be so much better than, and really spelling out the positive coalition. I think it's understandable why negative coalitions come together, because it's actually much easier to agree on what you're against than to agree on what you're for. But it is the necessary work to inspire the next generation to say what you're for. And for that to actually meet them where they're at, right? My students who are undergrads care a ton about the climate, but they also care about having a more prosperous future than the one that they're staring at right now. And they care about, feeling inspired by and excited by the leaders in their country and other things. There's some things about which they all agree. And we can sort of start there, right? And build from there. But that hard work has to happen, and it's probably not going to happen in the streets. It's probably going to happen in the boring, quiet relationship building that happens in organizing work. And if it happens that organizing takes place and we build these broad coalitions and movements, then, if there is protest and there is street mobilization, it's just going to be so much more powerful than without it.
Håkon?
Yeah, I don't think it's the whole answer, but I think part of the answer, if you want to engage the youth, is to give them responsibility and hold them accountable for it. So descriptive representation, having someone in parliament that resembles you in terms of age, gender, skin color, whatever, that works. And it doesn't work necessarily because you get different policies, but even if you get the same policies, you get higher legitimacy among the population of which you resemble. So if you want to engage the youth, you need to give the youth responsibility for policies and hold them accountable to it. And I think this is a particular issue for the U.S. The U.S. politicians, it has been shown in this campaign, are very old.
Kind of like professors.
Yes.
All of our established institutions, actually.
It's not just the presidential candidate, it's the Congress, it's the Senate. They are very old, and they are much older than European politicians.
Imagine in 2019, it was what we are calling that the youth scream against climate change. That's just a few years ago. And then in 2020, the pandemic came. And then we forced all the young people to stay in their boys and girls room, stay there for their own, alone, for almost 2 years. And suddenly after we lifted the last sanctions for the pandemic, then Russia invaded Ukraine. It was in Europe, a new war coming. And it's easy then to lose hope about the future. And now we see in many, many European countries, and maybe even in the US, that the youth supports right-wing parties. I don't think they deny the climate change, but I think, as they say, you need to believe in a more prosperous future. You need to believe in yourself. You have to take care of yourself. The state put you in your boys and girls room, so they stop your own development in a way to live a free life. So I think we underestimate still the consequences of the pandemic. So I think we have to wait for some more years. I think still that they are concerned about the climate change and some of the big issues, but not right now. So it will take time. I think they're looking, it's more individual aspects and more focus on a possible prosperous future for them with the family, that they are not that occupied with all the big issues and questions after this 2 years. So I say that we have to wait for some more years to really get a clear analysis the reason for the very right wing that many youth people have taken. It's too premature. I have run for election 3 times, trying to understand the rapid development. The green ticket was so strong in 2019 throughout Europe, and it was the young people that lifted all that up. And now they are leaning to the progressive right-wing parties, maybe also the same people that was occupied about the climate change just for a few years ago. So I'm not sure what's happened, but we need to be, I think we need to be a little bit modest in our analysis, because it will take some more years really to find out what to do, and that's also important with solidarity.
I had hoped to end on a positive note, Raymond, and you kind of
this is a positive. Wait and see. It's a positive note.
That's okay. So we've gotten to the point where wait and see is the most positive thing we can get. No, but I'll give you, Erica, the final word, because you're now, this is a room full of people who have political influence. Norway has a lot of financial muscles, at least compared to its size. Yeah. What's your 2-3 priorities for how Norway should invest its oil wealth in global democracy?
Yeah.
Say research at PRIO. Say research at PRIO.
Yeah. Research at PRIO. Yeah, I mean, supporting PRIO is one of these like global observatories of what's happening in the world around peace and conflict, and it's, as I said, research has never been more important. I think Norway is uniquely positioned to be a convener of what I described as like a global democracy network. Norway is a member of the Community of Democracies, which is an official thing that has been a little bit dormant, but maybe now is its moment to be resurrected and to begin to have this new global conversation about renewing democracy, where we have some real talk about it, real talk, not just like, oh, we all love liberal democracy. We know, we don't all love it. Let's talk about what we're going to do, what's next, and what is it going to look like, and how are we going to build an irresistible positive coalition to have the next wave of democratization around the world. And then I'd say that the second piece is there's just no substitute for getting activists and organizers who are in countries in crisis to get them into the same room to talk for like a week at a time. Like take them out of where they are in survival and reactive mode 24/7 and get them to actually meet each other and begin to trust each other and build relationships so they can have a strategy for how they want to proceed to make their future together. Civil society, one of its kind of deep pathologies is its tendency to retreat into more fragmented formations, especially under pressure. And we just need to mitigate against that and continue to bring coalitions together and together and together. So those are the things I would say Norway can really help with. Your status in the world as a sort of key global mediator and convener, a country where you can literally talk to basically anyone in the world. This is not something most countries enjoy. And so I wouldn't waste that gift. I would use it now.
Thank you very much, and please join me in giving a big hand both to Professor Erica Chenoweth, to Håkon Gjerløv, to Raymond Johansen. And then we have some gifts, Erica. We have the special PRIO print for you, which is reserved for PRIO peace address speakers. Wow. This is sort of a little bit above your average carry-on luggage, so we'll be able to ship you a version without the big frame.
Amazing.
And then we have some flowers. We should say thank you all for attending, for coming. There will be a reception, so it's possible to both have a little bit to drink and to eat, to engage with the speakers, to perhaps get your energies up, so we can all mobilize for global democracy and participation. Please don't leave the room without being at least a little bit inspired by also what we have to do and what we should do. Thank you again to Erica for putting us on the right track.